Okay, so I'm talking with what is it? Bible history skeptic. What I forgot the name. I'm sorry.
Biblical history skeptic. You can just call me
Biblical
Chris.
history skeptic.
You can just call me Chris. So
Okay, okay. People are weird about their names. So I don't know. And I think I'm going to get a set of headphones here so I can kick up the volume without risk of echo. So you were going to tell me what I got wrong about the Bible.
well, there are a few things that I've noted. I for a little bit, and I wanted just to talk to you about them sometime. I first I just want to say that I don't mean any of this at all in any kind of antagonistic way, because you are literally the reason I'm here, and like you are the person that actually convinced me out of young Earth creationism.
Wow.
So
Thank you for that.
yeah, well, thank you, because before that I was going around street preaching and I went to the Creation Museum as if it were actually a good thing. So yeah, uh, the first things that I noticed, a lot of it wasn't actually was in your book. I actually bought your book when it first came out, and
Well, thank you.
the science and everything. I loved all the science and everything in it. There are a few issues with some of the history, though. Um, for example, one of the bigger issues I noted was where is it? Right here. Okay. Actually, right here on page 61, for example, where you were talking about Exodus 21:22 through 23. It says, if men struggle with each other and strike a woman with a child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet there is no injury, he shall surely be fined as the woman's husband may demand of him, and he shall pay wages as the judges decide. But if there is any further injury, then you shall appoint as a penalty life for life. And here you noted that Dr. Carrier said that injury was here actually more vaguely means evil, which is, I don't know where he got that. I checked with 4 different experts in Hebrew Bible, actually. The word being used is ason, which is a standard word just meaning like a bodily harm. It actually has no connotation of being evil. It's just destructive force. So I'm not sure actually where Dr. Carrier got that.
Well, that's another reason that I said that's what Dr. Carrier says.
Yeah, no, yeah. That one. Yeah, there was another one. This one was bigger. For example, when you said the Enuma Elish, the Akkadian cuneiform tablets of the Enuma Elish are the oldest of all creation myths. Actually, the Eridu Genesis in Sumeria predates that by several hundred years, and there's some.
What are the dates on either one?
The Enuma Elish probably has its oldest forms in the second millennium BCE. The Eridu Genesis probably has origins all the way back in the third millennium, and the tablets themselves are hundreds of years apart.
What I was reading had always said that Enuma Elish was the oldest and that it was in the third millennium.
No. The that I think they were confusing that with the Eridu Genesis. The Enuma Elish, the 6-tablet version that we have now, actually the main one, to my knowledge, is actually from the first millennium BCE. Actually, the 6-tablet variant, that is the standard that we usually translate from. But there's also, for example, when you said that the scholarly consensus is that the Bible was written by many human authors from different generations, different nations, and different religions, that one is not the consensus at all.
Wait, they're saying that it was written by one nation?
Well, definitely by one ethnic group, the Israelites.
I don't see how that could even be possible. It certainly isn't what any source that I was reading said. I mean, like rabbinic scholars, for example, admit that Judaism got more influence out of Zoroastrianism than any other possible influence. I mean, so there's no way that you can put that into a single ethnicity.
You are correct that it took influences from those, but it was not written by those people. It was written by the Israelites.
And then it was based on all of these Mesopotamian mythos, and although a lot of these people are technically Semitic, you know, there are some that want to exclude themselves, like what is the I'm drawing a blank on which group it was that got angry about they're Semitic, but they don't want to be called Semitic, so they want to call themselves something else. And then, for whatever reason, the body of Mesopotamians, whether they're Akkadian or Sumerian, they're not Chaldean, they're not, and so the Semitic race was supposedly, by somebody's classification, limited only to the Chaldeans, and that never made any sense to me how they came up with that. But okay,
Yeah.
But I mean, we have all these influences from throughout the Mesopotamian Empire and elsewhere.
Yes.
We have obvious, Persian influences and Greek and possibly Indian, if not Egyptian. So, and with these fables, with the original versions of these stories coming from what would have to be, by their own definition, non-Semitic groups, you can't say that it was written by one ethnicity.
Well, I can. So the nation of Israel, in particular, we know has existed since the 13th century BCE. We have that recorded on the Merneptah Stela and a bunch of other stuff. But we also know that all of the books in the Bible look like they are written by those people. They do have influences from a lot of these different groups. For example, you have the flood myths that are definitely being passed down from generation to generation through a very common ancestor and a very, very common influence there. You also have stuff like the Leviathan and the slaying of Tiamat and all that has a great influence throughout the Bible as well. All that, like the Leviathan in particular, that's derived from earlier Canaanite religion and stuff like that. So you definitely have all these influences coming around, but it's not correct to say, though, that these stories were written by people of other nations.
Okay, well, look at you mentioned the flood already. Yeah. So we have Sumerian, Babylonian. We have a host of different claimed authors for that. And we know that there's like one core story that they're all basing this on. So already we have multiple sources for the exaggerations, interpolations, and enhancements that other people were adding. And then look at the Garden of Eden story. Look how many different stories that's made out of. And again, they're certainly not all from the Jewish nation.
Well, it's not actually quite correct to also say that it's the Jewish nation, because a lot of these were created before Judaism itself was a thing. Judaism was a result of after the Babylonian exile. A good number of all these books were written pre-Judaism, but it's still the thing is that as Judaism evolved out of Israelite religion, which evolved out of Canaanite religion, and then some influence from somewhere else. We actually have no idea where the worship of Yahweh began at all.
I read somewhere, and I could never find the source for it again. It was a wonderful text that had these pictures of Ugaritic swords, for example, and I was in love with the Ugaritic sword. It was the most fascinating sword I'd ever seen. Mm-hmm. But in the same story, it gave a Canaanite account for the origin of Yahweh. Can't find any reference to it. It was back in the days when I didn't think to make notes to go back and this is going to be useful later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's
I'd be really interested in finding that, because we don't have any Ugaritic tablet in existence that mentions Yahweh, to my knowledge. Yeah. I've gone through a good number of them. I've asked leading scholars like Dennis Pardee and Mark S. Smith also about this, and they said that there's no evidence that Yahweh was ever worshipped in the Ugaritic religion. Yeah. We don't have evidence of it in any Canaanite religion, actually. He's not.
I want to throw out there that just because I read it somewhere, means that I give credence that this claim was made. But if I can't verify who made it, then I can't even, I can't claim their credibility. I don't know why they made that claim. And frankly, I've read an awful lot of dishonest and misrepresented assertions.
Yeah. I mean, I've read my fair share of those too. Unfortunately, there's no shortage of them, especially on apologist websites.
Yeah. Now, one that I often get criticized about, that I'm constantly told that I was wrong about, I quoted the selected expert, that this is what he said, but I'm constantly get flack for quoting what he said as if I said it. When what was the guy's name? Meyer, University of Michigan, I think it was. He was on an episode of Penn and Teller's Bullshit.
Yeah.
And he was talking about how the Bible came to be and how it was being retroactively written. It was written after the fact by people the churches were all running on their own, kind of willy-nilly, and then people would be after the fact picking up which stories from whichever collections of books are these sermons being given about. And so they kind of put the Bible together backward from that.
Yeah,
And then
definitely to a
they had
degree.
a number of meetings, as I remember, culminating in, and I believe the word culminating is even in there, culminating in the Nicene Convention, where they had the ultimate argument over whether Jesus was a created being or an entirely divine being. And then you have that schism, which my instructor believed led to the formation of Islam, which is why in Islam, Jesus never died.
Yeah, the church was almost unanimous that Jesus died. Where Islam gets a bit of its influence is actually a little bit out of Gnosticism. And particularly because actually around in Arabia and those areas, that is one place where Gnosticism managed to actually survive and thrive. We actually still have a Gnostic group there to this very day. The Mandeans that managed to actually survive throughout all that. But it is primarily, I think, through a little bit through their influence. And then there were also a few other really out there sects that were in the area that influenced it. I don't think it's probably a result of the schism, though.
Let me ask you a question. What are you studying?
I'm currently an English major, and I'm working right now in learning Hebrew and Greek and Syriac. And then I'm planning on becoming a PhD in Old Testament.
Very good. Very good. Like I said, there was a time in my life when I didn't think to make notes on how important these things would be later on. I mean, I remember before I read anybody talking about the parallels of Jesus to Dionysus and other gods, that I happened across. I was reading a work on Dionysus. I was reading a book about Dionysus. It was the classic I don't remember which one, but it was the classic mythology, when he starts talking about how he is the fruit of the vine and he is the vine and all of that. Like, this is Jesus talk.
Mm-hmm.
What is going on here? But I didn't make reference to it. And so years later, now I want to pool on that, except that who knows what the hell that was. And I don't have time to go read through everything to try to find it again.
Right.
The question I wanted to ask you was the Coptic Gospels. Have you read those?
I have a little experience with them. I have no experience with them in their original languages. There are very few people that Coptic very well.
I've only ever read it in English, and of course, it's. I am embarrassed to say that I am an American monolingual. I would like to fix that, but who has the time? The thing I got out of the Coptic Gospels was that they are bizarre. I mean, they date back to almost as old, and some people say as old as Paul, or not Paul, John.
Are you talking about the Nag Hammadi texts?
Yes.
Yeah, those are the Nag Hammadi texts. Those are 3rd century. That's the consensus right now, is that those come about from the 3rd century. The oldest one among them, though, is the Gospel of Thomas, and there are a few scholars that do give that an early dating. Right now the consensus is probably early or mid 2nd century, so possibly around the same time as the Gospel of John. There is one scholar, John Dominic Crossan. he actually dates it earlier than the Synoptics.
Okay.
No one agrees with him, but yeah.
Yeah, I know scholars nobody agrees with them.
Yeah.
I'm fine. And Christians, I myself have a mythicist position, though I don't have a dogmatic aspect of it.
Mhm.
I mean, I think that Jesus is too obviously a composite character, right? There's too many, and I'm thinking that there are actually real people in here, because I've gotten into arguments with so many Christians who claim that, among other people, like Jesus of Damnius, they say, well, that's our guy, that's James, the brother of Jesus, who was the anointed or whatever. No, that's a completely different character. But here
Yeah.
you are claiming that he's your guy, right? Well, how often
Yeah.
has that happened? I've seen Jesus ben Ananias claimed by Christians as their guy. It's wrong decades off, but they're still claiming that. So I get the impression that if you had a time machine, this is just the way I feel about it personally. If you had a time machine and you spoke Aramaic, you would not be able to find Jesus. And even if there is a living being at the base of that legend, I think there's more than one. And I think if you were to grab any one of them and take them forward and show them Jesus Christ Superstar, that they would not recognize that the story was about them.
Yeah. Oh, I definitely agree. I definitely agree with that latter part. I'm not on the same board. I'm not really dogmatic about it either. I am a historicist. I'm on like the Bart Ehrman side of things with like apocalyptic preacher. But yeah,
Well, if you agree
I
that there was more than one Jesus,
well,
that's not the historicist position.
well, I believe that there was only one.
Okay.
I think that there was one apocalyptic preacher, Jesus, and then he just got mythologized over time.
Don't you see, like, John the Baptist being in what is the word? Is it interpolated, or yeah, that would be the word, where suddenly John the Baptist now has to bequeath all of his own popularity to Jesus, who's the new character that they've just invented. So John the Baptist has to baptize Jesus, and whatever popularity he had, he now has to transfer to Jesus, the same way that the Muslims now have Jesus referring people to Muhammad. Do you follow that?
I can see where one could go with that, but at the same time I don't really see that quite as what John the Baptist would have actually been doing. I mean, it looks like he was just an itinerant baptizer of some kind that just went around doing that. So Jesus would have just been one of many that came and did that.
It seemed that he had some popularity at the time.
Huge amounts of popularity, according to yeah.
So they kind of take his star power and apply it to this new character.
Yeah, it looks. I mean, if we were to assume some accuracy for the gospel accounts, and it does look like the gospel accounts of John the Baptist's life are pretty accurate, especially when they're coincided with Josephus. It would look as though what ended up happening was after John the Baptist was executed, because Jesus didn't actually start preaching until, according to that, until several years, a few years after that. It would look like what ended up happening is after he started his preaching, people started thinking that Jesus was like somehow a risen John the Baptist. That's what the gospel writers ascribed to Herod, if I remember correctly. He was like convinced that that Jesus could have been, some kind of a risen John the Baptist or something like that. But in terms of that, what probably actually happened was that John the Baptist baptized Jesus, got executed when he became really popular, and then when Jesus started preaching around and was gaining popularity, people started attributing a lot of John the Baptist stuff to him in order to, because it's probably likely that John the Baptist was also another apocalyptic prophet. So they just started attributing like his prophecies and his sayings as applying to Jesus.
So I remember having this conversation with David Fitzgerald, and I said that there's when I still held the historist position, I said there are certain things that imply that there's actually a first century faith healer who is every bit as dishonest, disingenuous, as every bit as much a huckster as what we have today.
Hmm.
Where he wants to he wants to take donations to give to the poor. Yeah, yeah, right, right. That's what he's doing with it. Just like Bobby Tilton with his orphanage that
Oh my
didn't
goodness.
really exist in Haiti.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I said, okay, like one of the things that implies that we have this actual madman who doesn't know what he's talking about. There's a lot of things that Jesus says that, although people celebrate everything that he says, it's surprising to me. There's very little that Jesus says that isn't actually crazy. And one of those is the thing about the fruit tree, where he curses the fig tree for not producing figs out of season.
Hmm.
And Fitzgerald, and I wish I could remember what the argument was for that. What are the details of that? I said, now here we have this story. This applies. I mean, why would they create this God character and have him be such a buffoon as this? And Fitzgerald's argument was that even the name of the place where the tree existed was fictitious and had symbolism some other way. So he said that entire story never happened. That it was manufactured after the fact, as was the story of the the adulteress being stoned.
Yeah.
So I mean, how many other of these stories are just being made up after the fact and then thrown into the book, right? And
A
then you've
great,
got
a
the
great number
15
of them.
gospels that Bart Ehrman himself talks about. So we've got like a whole collection of different stories that all end up being attributed to Jesus. There's no way that all these stories have to do with the same guy.
Well, no, they could definitely all have to do with the same guy. It's just that they're just being more and more mythologized over time, especially as people are becoming more theologically conscious of what they're trying to say about him. For example, Matthew is obsessively concerned with prophecy in the Old Testament and how that applies to Jesus. So he goes out of his way to turn Jesus basically into the new Moses.
Yeah, and then he misquotes it too, which is a surprising
Yes.
thing.
Yep.
And how do the scholars not catch this when he refers to Isaiah 7, for example? That Jesus' birth by a virgin was the fulfillment of that prophecy.
Oh, well, no, scholars have noted this. Oh, they've noticed for ages that it's because we've known for it comes out of basically the Greek Septuagint because the Greek Septuagint translates the word alma as parthenos, which parthenos in Greek is polysemous like many other words, so it could refer to just a regular young woman, or it could refer to a virgin. But the later writers of the New Testament took it to mean virgin. So they, because they weren't, reading from the Hebrew, which would have actually clarified that a little bit. But even the word alma could possibly have some connotations with virgin, but it's not exclusive. The exclusive word for virgin in Hebrew is betulah. So scholars have noted this for ages and ages, and everyone's had a good laugh at it.
Except for the ardent believers who are in control of everything in my state government.
Well, yeah, Texas.
What is your motivation to be as would it fair to call you a biblical scholar? That is what you're going for?
Yeah. My motive. I mean, the first thing that actually motivated me was because originally I was actually right after I became a young Earth or left young Earth creationism, thanks to your videos and everything, I ended up deciding that I didn't want to sound like a dumbass every time I opened my mouth. So I decided to start researching on it a whole lot. I actually ran into Richard Carrier's videos, and it's funny because I now ardently disagree with almost everything Richard says. But he's the one that basically started me on the path, because I was like, okay, so a lot of what's being said in here isn't what I think. I should probably start researching this. So I was in actually the mythicist camp for quite a long time. And then I ended up getting into Bart Ehrman's work. As you can see behind me, almost this entire top shelf is Bart Ehrman. But yeah, and so I decided that I really wanted to research it, and then I kind of just fell in love with researching the stuff and figuring out more about it. And particularly, what I ended up falling in love with was the Book of Job. This is what is probably my favorite book of the entire Bible, because especially if you read the dialogue portion of it, because it's so relatable. Especially like what I wish that believers would read it as it's actually written and not just trying to interpolate things into it, because Job comes within like a hair's breadth of blasphemy, and it's glorious. Like it's absolutely wonderful. And it has a ton of it actually retains a whole lot of the Canaanite mythology from before. Hence why it talks about Leviathan and his battle and Behemoth. Behemoth being this, it's basically a holy celestial bull, and then Leviathan.
You get bull.
Yeah,
This is bull for you.
It's actually pretty clear, because what it talks about its tail and everything, it's actually a euphemism for its penis.
Well, you could take a literal interpretation of, if you look at the cedar that was in that country, not this country.
Mm-hmm.
The Middle Eastern cedar actually does look, turn it upside down, it actually does look like an elephant's tail. And such a thing, if it moveth like a cedar, did not say that it's as big as a tree. What it said was that it moves like a cedar. So this wispy little tree that they have in the Middle East, if it moves in the wind at all, it's the same thing as the fly swatter kind of tail that an elephant has. But more importantly, in the bit about the description of Behemoth, I mean, it describes everything that is an elephant in my book, except particularly when it says that it has a nose that pierceth snares. It's not a horn on the nose; it's a nose. So there's no other way I could interpret that.
Right. Well, the thing is that it could also be interpreted as a bull's nose as it goes through like the snares of the grass and everything like that. It also, you have to look at it in its poetical context as well, because it's also being put in the same context as Leviathan. Leviathan, we know for a fact, is derived from the not the Ugaritic precisely, but it's derived from the same origin as the Ugaritic Lotan. It's a multi-headed celestial chaos dragon.
But the description they give perfectly matches a Nile crocodile.
Not really. Actually, if you actually look at Leviathan in the Psalms, it actually describes Leviathan as multi-headed.
Okay, but Job describes it as having a mouth that is like doors.
And
the back is many different shields all fastened together.
Right. It's likely that the crocodile might have been an inspiration for it, but that's also similar language. The language that he also uses when describing battling Leviathan and control of Leviathan is very similar language that was also used by Baal when Baal controls Lotan. And linguistically, we can actually prove that there's a linguistic similarity between the two as well. They actually have a linguistic relationship with each other. So we are very certain, and a good number of the most recent studies on Leviathan have concluded that it is a chaos dragon, and that we've actually been misidentifying it for quite a long time.
Well, I'll grant that Nile crocodiles obviously don't breathe fire. And
Yeah.
so in one passage, if it mentions that it has multiple heads, that doesn't change the other passage where it really does pretty closely describe a crocodile. But they're kind of like made up monsters from different authors anyway.
Yeah, they're definitely, mythological monsters. Yeah. It's hard. It's really not always correct to say that they're all from different authors. Where we can find that they actually quote other authors, then we can say stuff like that. For example, when we look at the flood epic in Gilgamesh, and two of the variants that we have of Atrahasis. The most recent one was found by Irving Finkel. We can actually show where they're literally quoting verbatim those passages. In the book of Job, we can't really show that. We can come pretty close, actually, in Isaiah, in Proto-Isaiah. Proto-Isaiah is probably one of the absolute earliest parts of the Bible.
So by absolute earliest, we're talking about roughly, I mean, Isaiah was a guy who, I accept that Isaiah lived and was supposed to have been about 700 BC.
Yeah, 8th century BCE is around time of Proto-Isaiah, yeah.
Okay.
That it's going to be right around that same time where we're also getting some discussion of I think it's in Proto-Isaiah where it talks about Leviathan in there, and the language used to describe Leviathan is borderline verbatim from where you can find it in Ugaritic texts as well.
Well, isn't that the same thing with like Moses's birth story of being set afloat in the reeds and that of Sargon?
There are literary parallels, but there is no quotation. No.
Okay.
That's one reason. Scholars are really going back and forth right now. There's a lot of debate over whether or not they were basing Moses off of stories of Sargon and stuff like that. There's a lot of back and forth on that right now. The consensus broadly in scholarship is that Moses probably never existed. I don't hold that view. I'm actually on board with scholars like Heath Durrell. I think that there was a historical Moses, but very minimalistic and not in any way how Exodus really describes him. But I think Exodus does have some cultural memories. Mark S. Smith, if you ever check out his book, The Early History of God, he actually posits that the worship of Yahweh began in either Edom or Midian, and he began as a war god, which is basically the leading hypothesis right now for a lot of scholars.
It's interesting that it would start out as a Median god.
Yeah, it's very interesting because the Medians are from there's a lot of debate over them. We have no writings from them at all, so very almost impossible to tell like linguistically what they would have spoken when they were around. But their pottery shows strong influence from the Aegean. So if Yahweh was
are they Greek?
Yeah, they would have been like Proto-Greeks.
Okay.
So it's really interesting. If Yahweh began with them, there's the possibility that Yahweh actually began plausibly as an Indo-European god, not as a Semitic god, and that he was then introduced into the system. And right now we are there is basically a complete consensus among most critical scholars, even among many Christian ones. Like Mark S. Smith is actually Catholic, but the consensus is basically that Yahweh began with a cult outside of Israel, and then he got introduced at some point, and then he began syncretizing with the Yahwistic cult syncretized with the Canaanite cults, and then he took over gradually. So
I wish I had the time to pursue the type of scholarship that you're doing. And I had spent so much of my time in my youth, honestly, just wasting it. And I didn't become interested in actual academic pursuits until, say, 20 years ago. Which I'm talking to somebody that's probably your age, but I spent a long time after your age just being stupid. And I regret that now.
Yeah, I regret a lot of things in my past. Spending 18 years as a young Earth creationist was part of it. Wasted a lot of my life throwing around stuff like Ray Comfort and Ken Ham. I still have their books right here on the floor, actually. I don't have room on my shelves, and they're not deserving of supplanting anything. So
I don't know if you can hear fuzz. Can you hear a background noise on my mic?
just a little bit.
Okay. My wife is frying something, so I apologize for the noise. There's nothing I can do about that.
Oh, that's fine. No problem at all. So one thing I wanted to ask you about was your little bit about Beelzebul and Beelzebub, and you're saying in the book that that Beelzebul was a Ugaritic deity, and that New Testament scribes then demonized him as Beelzebub.
Did I
Right?
not give the source on that? Because I thought I did.
No, you didn't give a source
Okay,
on
so
it.
there was a translation where if the Beelzebul was supposed to be it's Baal, Lord on high, or Lord of the house, or something like that.
Yeah,
I'm barely able to remember this at all, but that it was translated into the Bible as Beelzebub, which made him Lord of the Flies. It was just a tweak in the language to get a little dig in there.
yeah,
And so it's that kind of, if you're going to be making these kind of digs, deliberately distorting the language to do that, this is another indication that it's certainly not the word of God. This is obviously the word of men with their own agendas and biases and prejudices, obviously.
yeah. So it's actually really interesting. So the only time that he's called Beelzebub is actually in the Hebrew Bible. The New Testament actually calls him Beelzebul. In the Old Testament, what's really funny about it, though, is that we're actually pretty sure that that is the original name, if the deity even existed at all. And one thing is actually it's
What
a
do you
film.
mean, if the deity existed? You're not going to convert to Baalism, are you?
No, well, okay. I'll clarify. The worship of the deity
Okay.
existed. The one thing is that it's actually a Philistine deity, not a Ugaritic one.
Isn't there a historical record of the Baal worshippers and having heavy contract? It kind of throws me off because I
Yeah,
always thought that the Medians worshipped Baal, so I don't really know. Obviously, you
yeah.
said
We have no idea really what the Midians worshipped, just because we have no writings from them at all. We know that the Philistines ended up they were Indo-Europeans originally. We actually have shown that they were Aegeans that came over. They were actually some of the sea peoples that helped sack Egypt and the Hittites and Ugarit. And then they came over, settled, and it settled in Canaan, and then they took on the language and the religion of those people. So we know for a fact that they worship Dagon and Baal and probably El and a good number of other deities as well. The problem is the epithet Beelzebub. We don't know for sure. There is, though, a Ugaritic tablet where it says that says how they called upon Baal, basically as for a form of medicine and in witchcraft, and he'll expel flies from sickly people and stuff. So we actually think that there's actually the possibility that if it was legitimate, could have been a legitimate epithet of Baal and not actually a parody or anything like that. What's really funny, though, is actually I went through with my friend Brack, and he's right now working on studying the Hebrew Bible professionally as well, and he's Orthodox Jew as well. And we went through and we looked at Baal Zebul, if we put it into Hebrew. And actually, what it basically would translate to, if you did it in Hebrew, would be Lord of Shit. So if they were going to change it to anything, they'd actually change it from Baal Zebub to Baal Zebul, because that'd be even worse, in a way.
Isn't there a translation in Hebrew for? I thought it was Lord of the House or Lord on High.
Yeah, there is the Lord. Well, quasi. the one that we generally translate as Lord on high is El Elyon, like God on high, or the God most high, or God the highest.
Okay, but I mean, in the Baal Zebul, I mean, is there maybe, because I don't know Hebrew, so I mean, Lord of shit, I don't know how you would get that, but if Baal Zebul was supposed to be like Lord of the House, or the I can't remember.
Yeah, the Beelzebul doesn't actually, that translation doesn't actually come about out of the Hebrew. It actually comes out of the Greek.
Okay.
That's where that problem comes about. If you take it into the Hebrew directly like that, that's where you get Lord of shit, because it's the transplanting of the lamed for a instead of a bait. So Beelzebub ends in the bait, the B, whereas Beelzebul in the L, so you get a completely different meaning than in the Hebrew. So yeah, it is a really funny mess. But there's a few papers on it. There's not been a whole lot recently that's been done over the topic, but most scholars are of the opinion that if Baal Zebub was an actual epithet of a god worshipped, then it was probably a legitimate one and not actually like a satire per se. There was another one right here on page 75. And you said the rest of what became the New Testament was finally canonized by the 4th century after a series of committee decisions at a convention in Nicaea.
And this was right where I said I thought the word culminated in there. Finally, after a series of, you by the 4th century, so that throughout that time, by the 4th century, we finally have it canonized.
Okay, so you don't think it was canonized at Nicaea?
Right.
Okay.
That was what I brought up before about about quoting Meyer, and then everybody thinks that they just gathered it maybe, and I'm sure I believed this at one point, that they just gathered all these books together and said, okay, which ones are in the Bible and which ones aren't. But that was from like the video from 10 years ago, and the book has some. The book makes reference to a number of things that I had been corrected on, and so I had changed those positions in the book then over what the videos are. There's a couple things scientifically that I got wrong in the videos too, and I have to address those in the book.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify on that because I wasn't sure, so I didn't want to accuse you of that particularly. It was just a little ambiguous, so I just wanted to make sure. One thing was your characterization of the Gnostics. You said Gnosticism is actually a pre-Christian concept of knowledge through faith, which essentially means convincing yourself to be absolutely certain of things that are really just idle speculation, or pretending to know what you don't really know. Well, I am curious where you got that conception of Gnosticism.
If I remember correctly, that was in my. I took a class in the comparative history of world religions. It might have been 2 classes. I think it was just. It might have been just one. I don't know. But it was in that class, if I remember correctly, that I got this explanation that the Gnostics, the Medianites and Docetic, or something, not Medianites.
Ebionites?
Ebionites, thank you. Ebionites and Docetics actually predated Christianity. Now, I took that to mean that they predated Christ as opposed to Christianity. So I might have based that, or that the impression that I got was that these people were doing the exact same thing that a lot of evangelical believers do right now. That it's all about, can you convince yourself? If you can convince yourself that it's true, then it's good enough as being true, or the power of your mind, you can actually make it true.
Okay.
And that this was the position the Gnostics held.
Yeah, no. The Gnostics had this. It is one of the craziest and wackiest ideas, and I absolutely love it. It makes normal Christianity look really, really, really boring. Like, so the Gnostics believed that the world was created by an absolute moron.
What the world was created by what?
by a moron, basically. They thought
So
that,
are we talking about the Coptic Gospels again?
yeah, well, some of them, the Coptic Gospels, a lot of them, like the Gospel of Judas and Thomas, are Gnostic Gospels. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a hard read. I mean, I'm realizing it. I'm reading it in English, and I don't know if that actually makes it worse or not. But when I read that, it was nigh unintelligible.
Yep.
But what I got out of it was that God, Yahweh, um, was created in ignorance of his own origin. That he was created by these number of goddesses who then backed out of the picture so that he would wake up. That he was an abortion, first off, that they brought to life, and that when he awoke, because the people who had created them had backed out where they couldn't be seen, he awoke to think that he pre-existed everything, that he's the first thing that there is.
Yeah. So what
It is extremely comedic view of Yahweh.
yeah, it's very funny. So, well, what they're talking about there, it's called the demiurge, this evil, capricious god. They either conceptualize him as an idiot or as completely malicious. And their arguments for it were like, look at the world. The world is shit. How can you not say he's not capricious? So that what they believed was that there was a good God. He's not, and many of the Gnostics, particularly the Gnostics of the Gospel of Judas, they were called, they were labeled the Canaanites by the Orthodox people. They believed that all of the good guys in the Hebrew Bible were serving the evil God, so they're actually the bad guys, and they believe that all the bad guys were actually the good guys because they're fighting against that God.
It's easy to read the Bible and come to that conclusion too. I mean, because look at everything that God does, right? Whatever, everything He does is wrong. And from my perspective, if was it Abraham who's arguing with God? Well, what if there's only 10 people? Would you burn the city then? If you can negotiate like that, then we're not talking about the art of the deal kind of level negotiate, or maybe we are. Subtle jab at people who don't really negotiate all that well. I mean, God is not a brilliant character anywhere in the Old Testament.
Well, yeah, I think it's very the way that Peter Enns is, he's an Old Testament historian and he's a theologian, and I don't always like
Who is that? I know that name.
He wrote he's currently on the blacklist from Answers in Genesis because he has critiqued the crap out of them. And his basic opinion, I'm not quoting him, but it's basically, if you actually believe that the earth was created in 6 days, you're basically believing in a fairy tale. And actually, my professor, who's a Methodist preacher, he has literally said, anyone who believes that talking snakes are real has a mental problem. He just doesn't have patience for it. He's a trained PhD Old Testament historian. His wife is a PhD evolutionary biologist.
My professor was very enthusiastic, very knowledgeable, had personally visited all of these different shrines all over the world, had a doctorate degree, and was a Methodist, claimed to be a believing Methodist Christian. Mm-hmm. But he obviously didn't buy much of it. and I'm happy to say that I was his star student in a room full of Christians, which is frustrating. He'd be very enthusiastic. He's giving these lessons and nobody's picking up on anything. Nobody has any questions. If he asks questions of the crowd, nobody knows anything. I think I'm the only one that got a good grade in that class.
I sympathize greatly with your professor.
I remember him getting really frustrated at one point that nobody in the class was paying attention to what he's saying or getting involved in, except for myself. I thought it was all fascinating. I brought one of my kids into the class just so that they could experience this atmosphere, because I thought it was very positive.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that I think that the greatest detriment that Christians do to themselves is not liking the scholarship. And I can get why they don't like a lot of it, because there is safety in thinking that what you believe is right. There is that safety internally. I completely understand that, but they're just shooting themselves in the foot, because eventually all their kids are going to go to college and realize that that was bullshit.
Yeah.
And
I'm
yeah,
dealing with an evangelical right now who his one of his kids became of age and contacted me and starts telling me about the horror story that is her childhood under the sky, and as is trying to rescue her little brother who's still in his clutches, so to speak. So I ended up talking to the guy himself, and it's been interesting.
yeah,
I'll just let Eck go.
yeah. I recently had a friend of mine. She was like total 6-day creationist, the whole 9 yards for ages. When she went to college, the first day of for her first biology class, she wore a T-shirt saying "Question Evolution" on it. I was thinking, you're just asking to fail that class, aren't you? But she just recently came out as a lesbian, which has been the greatest little explosion within our the church ever since then.
Yeah, one of the reasons that this one person contacted me was that she said that she was sent to gay conversion therapy, and that experience was so horrific that it left her nightmares.
Oh my gosh.
So I've been informed that I've got 10 minutes.
Okay.
So
Let me just I do want to just note one other thing. So you noted that on 75 through 76 that there were a number of books that were removed from the Old and New Testament.
yes, and I included the list.
Yep. The I fail to understand though how they were removed.
Because the Bible makes reference to them.
Right, but that doesn't mean that in order for them to have been removed, they
If the Bible is the word of God, this is the argument, is if the Bible is the word of God, why would God say at any point, if you don't believe me, go read what this guy said in a
right,
book that isn't part of the Bible anymore?
right,
So how could it be God's word if either somebody else wrote it and or somebody else edited it out of the compilation? Why does the word of God refer to human works that aren't even available anymore and that don't even exist anymore? This is an infallible God, remember?
right.
So why would he refer us to books that don't even exist?
Yeah, I do agree with you to an extent, but the problem is that in order for them to have been removed, they had to have been included at some
And they are included by the fact that the books that are included in the Bible reference the ones that are not.
Well, referencing them is different from including them.
But this is
part of
God.
Oh, I get that. I get that. But I also think it's kind of funny that God, in order for God to validate himself, he has to reference other people. But the thing is that because they were never included, they couldn't have actually been removed. For example, like the prophecies of Enoch and the book of Jasher, none of those were ever actually a part of the canon at any point.
Well, I realize that humans did not decide that the infallible word of God would include those books that the infallible word of God refers to.
Right. So, yeah, the problem I have with it then is just because it is a little, the wording just doesn't really get that.
Okay, well, I didn't mean to imply that they had ever been accepted by a human community as canon.
Okay. Yeah. That's what I just wanted to clarify there, because that I feel could be read a little misleading in a way.
Yeah. One of
But
the advantages that I did get out of my book was that I had a decade of arguing with people before I wrote it. And so some of the things that I got challenged on, of course, are clarified because I got challenged, and now I know where other people are getting this impression from what I said. So I rephrase that so that I can avoid that in the future, and it makes the argument stronger. But of course, it didn't happen with everything.
yeah. I completely understand that, especially right now, because I'm working on 2 papers right now on some biblical issues. So it's I understand the not being able to get discourse on everything like that and all. Yeah. One thing is that you did misstate the Dead Sea Scrolls.
What's that?
Uh, you dated the Dead Sea Scrolls from 335 BCE to 122 BCE in the book.
And
It's
isn't that by carbon dating?
yeah, you said it was by carbon dating. I did though actually check, and most of the Dead Sea Scrolls actually are from the 3rd century all the way to the 3rd century BCE all the way to the 1st century CE. Actually, we actually have some that are during the time of when Jesus would have been around and everything.
Okay, I was not myself even aware that there were Dead Sea Scrolls in the CE period, or that it would have been after
Yeah,
the supposed time of Christ. The only reference I knew of was the range from what was it, 330 to 120 or whatever that
yeah,
was.
yeah. 335 to 122. Yeah, that is the 335 is a little old for them. That would have been that's during the Hellenistic era. They were the Dead Sea Scrolls were roughly going around like the same time or later than when the Septuagint was started in its translation. So, and then there's not a huge amount of them from the Herodian period that I am aware of, but we do have some from the Qumran community that were from that uh, point in time.
All right. Well, Chris, I don't mean to cut you short. I have
Oh
been
yeah,
informed that I have to go. I want to thank you for constructive criticism.
yeah. Thank you for having me on.
Um,
Again, I don't mean any of this antagonistically. I just want to help as much as
I
possible.
appreciate that very much, and do encourage. I'm excited to going to live vicariously through your studies, and hopefully can have another meeting like this where you can instruct me some more.
Definitely, I'd love to have another meeting with you sometime.
All right, I have to go though. Talk
Okay,
to you later. Bye bye.
talk to you later.